Hey, just a heads up that the following content may be disturbing or triggering for some listeners and is not appropriate for children. Please take care of yourself and others who may be listening with you. Welcome to the Bonus Babies Podcast, a show that has no easy answers, only hard questions.
And suddenly there were these two little kids related to Nancy who needed foster care. And we didn't debate it for very long. It was fairly clear that if we preached this and then passed on an opportunity to do something about it, it was going to call into question, for at least ourselves, if not other people, why we said what we said professionally, but passed up an opportunity to do something about it.
Can you tell me what you call the kids who you've cared for over the years?
We feel that the children that we receive coming into our home are bonuses. So we call them bonus babies.
I love that. This is your host, Jayne Amelia Larson, and I'm a CASA, a court-appointed special advocate volunteer for youth in foster care. Yeah, I know it's a mouthful. In the same way a CASA works, I explore all things in the foster care maze by talking to kids, parents, caregivers, attorneys, social workers, therapists, really anybody and everybody who will speak to me to keep the conversation open and the information flowing about all things CASA. A few years ago, just as I was becoming a CASA, I met a guy named Sid Gardner, and I've learned a lot from him. Luckily, he's willing to share his story on the Bonus Babies podcast. And he has a really important story because he co-founded with his wife, Dr. Nancy Young, Children and Family Futures, that works closely with organizations really all over the United States on how to better care for children in the dependency system, but also how to better care for their families so that children don't get removed in the first place. But he has also fostered and then adopted children in his own extended family who needed a home and special care. So he doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk. Or I should say they do, because he's doing this with his wife. And I'm sure she's pretty special too. And I know Sid Gardner is pretty darn special. And I want to apologize because we had some technical difficulties in the recording. Nobody's fault but my own. Sid sometimes sounds like he's in a spaceship, and I sound like I'm on Mars. So, anyway, here it is. Hey, so good morning. I'm here with Sid Gardner. Sid, thank you very much for being on the show. So when you sent me your bio, it was super modest, like 3 sentences. So can I hear a little bit more about who you are and what you've done? You can condense it if you like, but I know you have a really complex and interesting background. I want to hear a little bit about it.
All righty. A slightly less abbreviated version. I'm a California native.
Woohoo!
Spent my first 18 years in California in a lot of then small towns growing up in the 40s and 50s. I was born in 1942 in Ventura and lived in Elsinore and Vista, graduated from high school in Bishop up in the Eastern Sierra, went to Occidental College, and then did graduate school in Princeton and was all set to come back to California. And I was interested in politics then and now. And some interesting opportunities came around my way to work in a political campaign in New York City for the candidate for mayor. I was at that time now somewhat extinct breed of a liberal or progressive moderate Republican, and John Lindsay ran for mayor in 1965. I worked in his campaign. He was elected in 1965. Became an assistant to the mayor, helped run the poverty program in New York. So from small town California, I ended up in New York, moved on to Washington after service in Vietnam.
Wow, you also served in Vietnam. Wow.
Yes, I was enlisted. It's a long, long story, but I ended up enlisted, and when I got to Vietnam, somebody looked at my jacket and said, "You used to write speeches. The ambassador needs a speechwriter." And that sounded like a somewhat less precarious way to spend my time in Vietnam. So I did that. I worked in the embassy, in the public information office, got to move around the country quite a bit, and worked with the ambassador and the public information staff. Came back to New York, ended up working in the federal government in Washington. Finished that up and decided to move back to California, lived in San Francisco for a couple of years. Then a colleague from Washington days was working in Hartford, Connecticut, so I lived there for 15 years, and in 1988 finally came back
Didn't
to
you also go to
California.
divinity school there somewhere in between, or?
While I was living in Hartford, I was living in a neighborhood in Hartford that was where the Hartford Seminary was based. Seminary is very internationally known now for its Christian, Jewish, Islamic coursework. I took a couple of courses and ended up with a master's degree in religious studies at the seminary. In addition to the master's degree I'd gotten at Princeton after I
So you're one of those overeducated, highly accomplished people that I hear about.
Well, definitely overeducated. I don't know about the accomplishment part, but I moved California, East Coast, Saigon, East Coast, back to California, and I'm now living in Las Vegas, which is a separate long story. My wife has family here, and the chance to live with some of our children in a house next door was not affordable in Southern California and is affordable in Las Vegas.
How did you end up working with children in foster care? I know you have professional experience as well as personal experience, so I don't know which one you want to start with. But
well, probably start even further back. I'm the oldest of 5 children. My father was a teacher and then a school principal. My mother taught, played the organ in our church. So education and lots of children was sort of a norm. When I got to graduate school, I became interested. It was mid-'60s. There were a lot of new federal programs, Medicaid, Medicare, coming along that benefited families and seniors and children. And I got interested in the children part of it. Worked for a while after I left the federal government for the Children's Defense Fund in Washington and other advocacy groups. Had done some writing about children's issues. When I was living in Hartford, I was elected to the city council for a couple of terms and worked on children's issues while in politics. So it was kind of a theme throughout, but at the policy side, I had studied it, written about it, worked in federal programs, and it was the policy arena I was most interested in.
And then you ended up founding the Children's Family Futures, right?
Children and Family Futures. My wife, Dr. Nancy Young, and I co-founded that. I had finished up some work at Cal State Fullerton when we were living in Orange County, and she and I started doing some consulting work, and it turned into a nonprofit, which is now a national nonprofit that she's the CEO and I'm the president. We founded it as a way of consolidating some of our consulting work and taking her interest in substance use disorders. She has a PhD from USC School of Social Work, and my interest in the federal program side and the advocacy side, and kind of put that together into this organization, Children and Family Futures. We're funded primarily by the federal government, but also by some national foundations. We've got a staff of about 66 people, half based in California, the other half out across the country, all working remotely now, of course. But that was a way of taking our individual projects and consolidating them in a nonprofit.
And I remember when I first met you, you used a phrase, don't talk the talk unless you can walk the walk. So can you tell me how that resonates with you?
Well, Nancy and I were married in 1991. She got her PhD at USC in 93. We were just beginning the nonprofit work and the consulting work that we were doing. And she had family scattered around the country, but primarily in California. And we were well aware that 2 very young children, when they first came onto our radar, they were 1 and 2.5, brother and sister. And Nancy knew their mother and her situation very well. It was clear that the father had left, mother was struggling, dealing with some of her own issues. It was clear that the kids were going to end up in foster care. And it became pretty obvious to us that about half the kids who go into foster care are reunited with their families. parents get their act together, and the kids go back home from foster care. It was pretty clear to us that this was a situation where the kids were very much at risk of not being able to do that dad was out of the picture and mom was not putting the pieces together and doing what she should have been doing. So spending our time professionally going around the country telling people, you really got to pay attention to these kids in the child welfare system, foster care and adoption and reunification with their parents when it's possible. This is really important work. And suddenly there were these two little kids related to Nancy who needed foster care. And we didn't debate it for very long. It was fairly clear that if we preached this and then passed on an opportunity to do something about it, it was going to call into question for at least ourselves, if not other people, why we said what we said professionally, but passed up an opportunity to do something about it. 26 years later, the kids have grown up. Our adopted daughter, they were in foster care with us for a couple of years and then were finally adopted when the parents' rights were terminated. And our daughter, now just turned 28, lives next door with our 3-year-old grandson and her husband, and our son, her brother, lives up the street in his own apartment. They're doing well. Ashley, our daughter, is parenting well, and we have the joy of a grandson who's 10 steps away. They live in a house, a 2-bedroom house on our property that has worked out very well for them having some separation. So it's been a long journey. There have been many, many challenges, but the rewards of knowing that we were having an impact on these two kids to the extent that we could as their parents, and also, and we certainly hadn't planned it this way, learning a tremendous amount about how the child welfare system works and how it fails. And that's our work. We work between the child welfare system and substance abuse treatment agencies, trying to connect two agencies that are off on pretty much separate tracks. And what we learned parenting these two little ones, now big ones, was of immense importance and changed the way we do our work.
Right, so you were working from the inside as well as from the outside.
Yeah, we advise state and local agencies around the country, and the lessons that we learned in dealing as parents, as consumers, as clients of the system, helped us understand that when a child welfare agency in South Dakota says they're going to try to do this for parents and do this for parents' treatment needs, what's really going on, what's real about that, and what's sometimes needs to be called into question or challenged.
So as the foster parents and then as the adoptive parents, did you feel that you were listened to and that you were well treated by people working in the system, or did you run into roadblocks regularly?
We kept track the first year of how many agencies we dealt with in trying to get what we thought the kids needed in the way of services and child care and then education in the public school system. We stopped counting when we got past 50 different agencies. Mental health, substance abuse treatment, the school system, the child care system, developmental disabilities, it goes on and on and on. And we met and were helped by some extraordinarily dedicated, highly competent professionals, and were afflicted by some of the least competent people who shouldn't be allowed in the room with children. So there's a very wide range of agencies and professionals and others who were trying to help kids, some of whom were definitely doing that, really understood what the kids were up against, some of whom just had no clue how to do their job or how to help
and you
children.
had particular challenges because your kids had issues because of the results of how they were raised in utero, right? I mean, how they were born.
Yeah, a lot of our work these days is with children who are prenatally affected by drugs or alcohol. Fetal alcohol syndrome, drug exposure, neonatal abstinence syndrome. There are many fancy medical terms for it, but basically when mom is using drugs, alcohol, or smoking, tobacco or cannabis, the kids are affected. There's no safe quantity of alcohol that can be used in pregnancy, according to all the medical societies and the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. All of those affect children. The most common substance that affects children in utero is tobacco, then alcohol, then hard drugs. Our kids were clearly prenatal exposed to most of those. We don't know any exact amounts, but they both have had special needs. They both were in special education classes during part of their K-12 education, and again, had some great teachers who understood what they were dealing with, and others who just had absolutely no idea what prenatal exposure meant to a third grader who couldn't follow instructions, or a fifth grader who had trouble athletically and dealing with others. Our kids have multiple diagnoses, but they were both cognitively and behaviorally. Their social emotional development was affected by the prenatal exposure, and then the early months before they were removed from their parents, the early months and the chaotic caretaking that they got in their first year.
You are also a very talented writer, and I wondered if you can share a little bit of your writing. There was a beautiful story that you wrote about when you took your son to Gettysburg. Do you have that handy?
I do, yes. I had from long ago, when I was part of a study group of high school kids who were taken in those days to train and bus across the country to visit the United Nations in New York. And we stopped in Gettysburg, and it was my first encounter with Gettysburg. And thereafter, living in Washington and on the East Coast, I visited Gettysburg, became extremely interested in the battle itself, what it meant to American history. Historians call it the hinge of American history, where things began to change in definite favor of the North. And so when I had a chance to travel with our kids, I wanted my son to see Gettysburg, see what had happened there. Ted Turner's magnificent movie, Gettysburg, which justifies Ted Turner's existence in total, as near as I can tell. It's just a magnificent. Every American should see it. Every high school kid should have to see it. My son had seen it a couple of times, and I wanted to show him. It was filmed in part at Gettysburg on the battlefield. So I took him there, and these are some of the lines that I wrote. I first took my son to Gettysburg when he was 8. It was January, a bright sunny day, and the drive up from Washington was easy. He was excited as we got closer. "Is that it? How far is it, Dad?" He had studied the battle in school, and we talked about it a lot at home. He knew more about it than anyone in his class, including the kid who knew everything. It was good that he had a subject that was his own, because school had been hard for him that year. It was the first year of the medicine, the succession of magic-making chemicals we put in his body to help him calm himself. The first time we gave it to him, I went into my office at home, where he could not see me, and wept. With the best advice we could get, we were giving mood-altering drugs to an innocent little boy whose birth mother had yielded to the terrible blend of addiction and pregnancy. We walked across the battlefield in the snow. It was better seeing it this way, his first time, than if it had been a hot July, as it was the first time that Gettysburg mattered. No one was around, and we could take our time seeing what we wanted to, instead of the standard canned tour. I could watch him to see what he was taking in and when he got tired. He is such a handsome little boy, thin in a way that makes you want to feed him all day long, to let him eat anything he wants because it burns off so rapidly. The counselor he sees is a gifted professional, working with him in what they call anger control by practicing ways to handle the aggressive impulses that speed through his brain. My son's battles are waged in the different segments of his brain. He fights skirmishes every day, coping with the difference between what the brain scientists call gross motor skills and fine motor skills. He can throw a baseball with startling accuracy and speed past bewildered little boys in Little League. He's such a good pitcher that this summer one of the umpires finally admitted he was imposing a different strike zone when my son pitches because, as the Empire said, there's nobody else out there throwing 100 miles an hour. So it was an attempt, as I've done in quite a bit of fiction, to reflect on what it meant to him, what it meant to me, and how to try to compensate for, how to try to build on what they're good at, to find out what they're good at and what they care about, and to teach him some things about larger issues that may affect his life.
It's very beautifully said, Sid. Hearing you read that is very moving. You express so well in just a few short sentences the challenges that you faced as a parent in trying to look after your children, after you had raised your own children, right? And trying to put the pieces together to help them get better, help them get treatment, help them get services, and take care of them in a way that you know they needed, way far above probably even what your skill set is, and you know a lot about this.
Yes, Nancy's PhD focused on this set of problems, children affected by prenatal exposure, what the policy and practice in child welfare and drug and alcohol treatment agencies, how that daily practice by professionals tries to respond to it. So we came into the challenges of trying to get them the services and the understanding that they needed, knowing a whole lot academically about, and in policy terms, both of our backgrounds. We knew on paper what they needed. We knew how to get the diagnostics, but we found that not everybody in the system knows that. And as we interacted with other parents, it became clear that the vast majority of parents don't have that kind of background, that we were blessed to have our own skill sets, challenged as they were by understanding where to draw the line between disciplining children who innocently were not at all good at some things, weren't at all responsive to some forms of discipline, to learn where to draw those lines and how to get help from professionals that were supposed to be helping them. We came to that with probably more of a skill set, at least in academic terms, than most parents. And the vast majority of foster and adoptive parents struggle with this tremendously. We work with a group based in California that focuses particularly on fetal alcohol syndrome, kids that have been exposed, severely exposed to alcohol during pregnancy. And some of these parents who deserve instant sainthood in my book are dealing with 39-year-olds whom they adopted at infancy. They've been with this that long. And as they and we age, we inevitably wonder about, well, what's the service system going to be? What's the family support system going to be when we're not around or not able to give them the kind of oversight that we continue to try to give them as they become independent adults? What's the response going to be? So we knew a lot about the system, its strengths and its tremendous weaknesses, and we wondered and tried when possible to help other parents who were coping with this bewildering system of dozens of agencies and eligibility and rules, and you can't get this kind of service because you're not in this category, and we only have categorical funding for this kind of child in this kind of situation. And we've tried to give people guidance whenever we can on how to do that kind of foster and adoptive parenting.
Right, and have you ever felt overwhelmed, you and your wife, Nancy?
Many, many times. We've had considerable difficulty explaining to other members of our family, supportive as they are. I have a 50-year-old biological daughter, and Nancy has a 37-year-old biological son from our earlier marriages, explaining to them why these kids need special attention, explaining to members of our family when our kids would behave at family gatherings in slightly less than flawless manner, what was going on is very difficult. You can't continually make excuses. You can't allow them to violate other people's privacy and personalities, but you're often drawing lines. We had a Thanksgiving this year, and as everybody dispersed, it was just the family members that live here in Las Vegas. And as everybody dispersed and went home, we turned to each other, and I can't remember which of us said it, and said, "I had a pretty good Thanksgiving. Nobody was arrested." Because there have been Thanksgivings where we had 30 or so people gathered together, and during the course of the Thanksgiving celebration, somebody was arrested. Without going into the details, that can be hard to explain. So we move the bar pretty low sometimes. But as I said before, it has so informed our work. I don't mean that the kids have been a research study, but we could never have done the work we've done or had the understanding we've tried to have without having lived this personal experience. And it's enriched our ability to empathize with people who are going through these struggles. We're very demanding of the system. We're both sometimes taken aside and said, you're a little too passionate about this. You can't be that hard on the system. And when you talk about the system failure, you can't be too hard. And we usually smile and say, well, yes, but we have lived through quite a bit of this for 26 years. And so we've got some, oh, okay, well, yeah, we didn't realize that. So we put on our professional hat, our academic hat, and our appropriate federal behavior for a federal contractor hat. And then sometimes we're just clients who have been helped and not helped by the system. And that's part of what we can share with people, that they will not always get what they want or need.
So when you started your not-for-profit, which has been very successful, in fact, you were recently rewarded for your work by the Child Welfare League of America, right?
Yes. Yes.
Did you have any sense of the scope and breadth and influence that you would soon wield, or did it start very small and just grow organically? Or
it was two of us in a garage, sitting in Irvine.
Okay,
as we got started.
Two of you in a garage.
Literally in a garage, like Hewlett Packard was apparently turned it in a garage up from Silicon Valley. But Nancy has always been CEO, and I have always been sort of strategic role as president, and we've worked that distinction of roles very clearly. She is gifted presenter. She works with people. We're one of those marriages between an introvert and an extrovert, where she is the heavy E, and I can do E when I have to. I was in politics. I could do that, some of that, but I had to go recharge after I did it. And the idea that we'd ever have 60-odd staff and considerable funding. If you told us that sitting in the garage, we'd never have believed you. But we've had extraordinary people who've worked in the system, some of whom themselves have had kids who've had some of these challenges, who've helped us. We owe a great deal to our staff. We've had some funders in the federal government and in foundations who understood and supported our work. We have been helped along the way by many people, mentors, medical people, academics, other elected and appointed officials in federal, state, and local government that we've learned a tremendous amount from. So the growth is, we've been able to preside over it and direct it, but we owe a lot to a lot of people who've been very helpful along the way, who've understood that this niche between, there are a lot of people that work in the child welfare system, a lot of people that work with courts that handle dependency cases, and a lot of people that work in treatment agencies. We try to put those together from very early days in my career, integrating services, working with health. When I worked in the federal government, I worked for what was then called the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And all three pieces work together and, in my view, belong together. Education got taken out at some point, and I think suffers for being as separate as it is from the health and the social services content that a third or so of kids in the school system still need. So we've had that background. The growth has been extraordinary, but with a tremendous amount of help.
Yeah, but you're so modest always. Can you name some of your favorite successes? That's an odd term. Can you name some of the work that you're proudest of?
Well, we're funded usually in response to a set of federal grants. Starting in 2002, the federal government made a series of grants that they're still making to this day. The appropriation that moved through Congress this week included money for what's called regional partnership grants, basically a child welfare agency at the state or local level, a treatment agency, and a judge, a family court come together and decide they're going to work together in a collaborative manner. So it's called a regional partnership grant. And we are then funded to provide technical assistance. So we, in the days before COVID pandemic, we would travel to those sites at least once a year. We would talk to them monthly. We would assemble them in a national convocation and let them talk to each other as well as to us. We ran a kind of a switchboard so that the project in South Carolina that needed to hear something from the project in Oregon could not just hear us, but connect with other people.
Right, so you're sharing
doing
information.
The same kind of job.
Right.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And expertise.
It's a clearinghouse, a switchboard, a lot of different kinds of, but we're intermediaries. We don't provide direct services. We provide support to those who do. And the chance to work across more than 100 sites every year. Cumulatively, since we were founded as an organization in 1996, we've worked with over 500 different organizations, state and local organizations, private agencies sometimes. I'm very proud, Nancy is very proud of the contacts that we've made with those agencies, many of whom have taught us at least as much as we've helped them learn through getting close to their work. We've written a lot of reports published in many cases by the federal government on child welfare changes, systems changes in treatment, what family-centered treatment needs to be. A lot of treatment is taking mom or dad over here into the treatment agency and then parking the kids someplace. Well, substance use disorders are a family disease. You can catch it from your family, you can catch it biogenetically, you can catch it from the behavior and the chaos in your family. And if the kids are over here, especially if it's a newborn, and mom and dad or mom alone is over here, then there's bonding and attachment that is so crucial to these kids. It doesn't happen. So we're proud of the work we've done in giving more of a spotlight to family-centered, family-focused treatment. We really have tried to emphasize agencies working together, and the toolkits that we've developed, which are all available online, have been used by dozens of these state and local agencies. So to have that bookshelf of technical assistance materials that we've written, to be able to apply it in hundreds of sites across the country over 2 decades and more, we're very proud of all that work. And again, I've received a tremendous amount of help from our own staff and from the people we work with in those agencies.
Can you tell me a little bit about your writing? I know that's a very important part of your life right now.
Well, I've always done nonfiction writing from early days, government reports, political analyses, the kind of writing you do when you're funded by or inside the government. Very early on, I guess in my 20s or 30s, I attempted fiction and had neither the time nor the skills or inclination to do it very well and set it aside. Then in my very early 60s, fast forward several decades, I had a bit more time and I knew what I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about the political and social issues, not only in our work, but the issues that I cared about. Immigration. If you're in Southern California and lots of other parts of the country, immigration is an issue. So I've written since 2002, 9 novels, self-published 8 of them. One is gestating on the shelf, trying to get better by osmosis, and I'm working on a 10th right now.
I feel you on that.
But the 8 that I've self-published, I didn't have time to chase down literary agents. The 8 are about our work. Our daughter, our adopted daughter, ended up in her teen years attending 6 different residential treatment programs in California, Utah, Texas, and Colorado. And as she went on this journey assigned to these programs by the school district and the mental health agencies that we were working with, we spent a lot of time traveling to those places, trying to be as helpful as we could and tune in. And she gave me permission to write a somewhat disguised novel about the stories. She was in girls' programs, and the stories that she'd share about these girls were at once tragic and hilarious. The girls had, as many of us do, learned to use humor as a salve to make things easier to endure. And my daughter gave me the permission to write a novel about that called The Middle of Nowhere. I've written others about those kinds of things. And it's turned out to be, they are certainly not great literature. I refer to them as, in the parlance of restaurants and sandwiches, as BLTs. They're book-like things. They're not really literature. They're BLTs. But therapeutically, being able to write in fiction about some of the things that we care about, some of the good things and some of the terrible things, has been a kind of self-therapy. I've gone to a number of writing classes. I'm enrolled in one at Stanford right now and have learned a lot. But it's mostly been trying to get some of the things I can't say in a government report, thinly concealed by the covers of fiction, and say some things that I want to say. So it's been very, very solid kind of recreation, recreation.
Yeah, and is the writing also a way for you to work through things that are hard to understand or hard to process?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I tried. They all have happier ending than great literature often tends to. But that's my attempt to try to work through some of the tragedies. One of them is about a baby who's born prenatally exposed and who's then kidnapped, and what happens to her and the people in her life and the agencies that could have helped her.
I read that one. That's a beautiful book. Tell me the name of it again.
Broken Bridges.
Yes, Broken Bridges.
It's set in a large, unidentified county of 10 million in Southern California, which makes it not very well disguised.
Not very secret, right?
It actually quotes some people saying some of the things that some people have said. But it was a way of writing about what the systems failed to do for this baby and for the people who were trying to help her. And that was a real release. It enabled me to work through, well, how would agencies and people at their most helpful have functioned? What would they have done? How would they have dealt with the barriers? And so trying to keep a plot going and some characters that made sense, as you have to do in fiction, was an important way of thinking about the issues, but with a lot more freedom than we have when we're writing a government report.
When you were a young man, did you think, well, one day I'm going to do some real good. I'm going to make a big difference in the world. I'm going to be that guy that helps families stay together. Did you have those dreams, or did you just get your education and have a family and grow up, and then it just fell in your lap? I'm going to do something great?
Well, my undergraduate work was in international relations. I mentioned this trip to the United Nations, and then I got to graduate school, and it was the middle of the 60s, and the Vietnam War was emerging as this enormous international tragedy, but we were also rolling out what was then called the Great Society, literally hundreds of federal programs launching in 64, 65, 66, and I got swept up in all of that. And a number of the people that I was in graduate school with, people that I'd been at Occidental with, gravitated toward politics and political careers. And I had always been interested in politics as an observer and got drawn finally into, when I ended up in Hartford, Connecticut, drawn into local politics, ran for office successfully a couple of times. The third time, long story, but I ran as an independent rather than as a member of a political party and was not reelected. So I had an exposure to politics, and politics was and remains an arena in which these issues about children and families gets played out. A lot of people work just in the executive branch, just in the agencies. I could tell that the politicians were making some of those decisions and wanted to get involved in that level as well. And so I still have more of a political lens on these issues than just somebody who works in the agency level, and gravitated toward writing about politics in some of the fiction as well.
And as a man, has your work changed you, or has it just made you more of who you already were?
Well, to raise children, as I said, I've got a 50-year-old daughter now whom I work with in our agency, which is a great joy. To be a parent is, if you take it at all seriously, life-changing in itself. You learn about these innocent little bundles and what they need, and then they grow up and they tell you what they don't need, and you have to deal with that stage as well. I think I've learned to listen. The novel I'm working on right now is about two people with very different political values learning to listen to each other, not trying to change each other, not convert each other, but learning to listen and learning why each of them believes what they believe, where their beliefs come from, in their background, in their family, in their own personal history. I think I listen better. I'm working on a piece now, reflecting on some of the lessons of our work. And one of the several lessons that I read of it is you have to know how to ask hard questions gently and persistently. And that blend between gently, if you keep asking hard questions and getting in people's faces, they're not going to listen to you. Or they're going to tell you, oh, yes, thank you very much, and then they're going to go do whatever they want to do. The persistent part and the gentle part, I had to learn both of those. Between my time in Washington and my time coming back to California, I held many jobs, too many jobs probably. I left some jobs out of impatience, out of an inability to get along with a boss or a belief that they weren't doing enough about the problem. And I bounced a lot in those early years, in my 30s and 40s. And I've become more patient. I've had only 2 jobs in the last 25 years. Part of that, my wife would tell you, is her calming influence. And part of that is the natural process of aging. You don't change jobs every 2 years when you're in your deep 70s. So that patience, the learning how to listen better, and the persistence, I've gotten better at that. We have a litany in our work that you can reduce our work down to, I used to say, 2 things: resources and results. The right resources, with the right funding, with the right staff, you can achieve better outcomes for children and families. My wife, a social worker, an extrovert, a gifted professional, and a pretty good person, said, you're leaving out the 3rd R, which is relationships. And she was right. Resources and results, that's the objective part. Relationships, that's the subjective part, how you get along with people, how you listen, how you care for them, and where you draw the line between what you let children and sometimes adults get away with, and where you say, no, this is unacceptable, or I'm going to tell you why I really don't like this. And that evolution has been uphill, is ongoing, I suspect, but I'm calmer, and that's a good thing.
Can I ask you, do you know anything about the CASA program? Have you worked with any CASAs?
I do. In fact, we have had on our staff, some of the staff people have been CASA volunteers and come back with fascinating stories of what they've tried to do, what they've been able to do as volunteers in support of these youngsters. I've made presentations to CASA volunteers in Orange County, trying to make sure that as they do their work with these kids, they're aware of the impact of substance use disorders on some of these children, both prenatally and in the families that the kids have grown up in and then been separated from, and making sure that they understand that dimension of both the biological and the psychological impact of substance abuse on families. So I have tremendous admiration for that work. The stories that I'm aware of, children who pass through the foster care system, some of them have been touched profoundly by the support they've gotten from volunteers, CASA and other volunteers. And so I value it immensely. I think it's an important adjunct. People that believe that the government can't do everything are exactly correct, and this is a wonderful example of how public agencies can reach out to the extraordinary talent and commitment of volunteers.
You know, I think I first met you when I had just become a CASA, and I don't want to say filled with fear, but let's say I was unsure about if I'd be a good CASA or if I'd make an impact or if the work that I would do would change a child's story for the better, as the slogan goes. And I remember being very encouraged by what you said, which was basically anything you do by focusing on a child in need is going to make a good difference.
Yeah, that's exactly right. These children, sadly, have had so little positive reinforcement. I mean, one of the things that I try to tell people who are going through fostering or adoption or considering it is that it's crucial you find out what the child is good at or what they want to be good at, what they care about. Build on their strengths. You'll always find something. Even in the most resistant child, there's something they care about, something they think they want to do, or that they've seen somebody they admire do and want to become like that person. Building on that inner drive and finding it, exploring who they are and who they want to be. A volunteer who cares about a child for even the limited amount of time that a volunteer can put in can sometimes trigger that and release that and watch it blossom and help it along the way.
Let me ask you, what is the one thing or things that no one would know about you unless you told them?
Well, I was going to say that I'm a novelist, but we've talked about that. That's improbable enough when I hang out with the people that I hang out with in my work, and that comes up. They say, "Well, how do you do that? Why? You know, it's improbable." The other thing, though, and it's predictable if you know the intricacies of my history, which I already mentioned. My mother played the organ in our church, and ever after, organ music has an extraordinary impact on me. I'm on a quest right now, a bucket list kind of thing, to visit and listen to the 10 largest pipe organs in the world. I've gone to Germany. Happily, 2 of them are in Southern California. There's 3 in the East. There's others, 1 in Milan. So I'm on this worldwide odyssey that I may finish, that I'm halfway through, listening to 5 of those organs. The power of the bass of an organ and the reeds and all the higher sounds that an organ produces are immensely moving to me. Which Nancy and I just watched. We had somehow never seen Phantom of the Opera, and we watched it the other night, and there's a huge organ moment in that, which is very, 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 very moving. So that's, I'm certainly not a music producer, but I'm a music fan with particular emphasis on organ music.
That's a lovely image to end with. Thank you, Sid. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sid and his wife thought that they'd be retired by now, traveling the world, listening to all those big organs. But it hasn't worked out that way because he stepped up. They stepped up, taking care of kids who need them, who need special help. And they're also helping to teach other families how to be a better family. As I said, they're pretty special. So thanks, Sid and Nancy. If you see something, say something. If you suspect that a child's health or safety is jeopardized in any way by parents or anyone else, contact the Child Protective Services Agency in your county. 24-hour hotlines are staffed by trained social workers who will help you through the process, and you can do so anonymously. In California, you can call the Child Protection Hotline at 800-540-4000. So if you see something, say something. You might be saving a child's life. I want to thank the supremely talented Christina Apostolopoulos for her beautiful music, Eferisto. To hear more from music, go to Spotify and Instagram at Christina Aposto. That's ChristianaAposto. I know you want to. Her stuff is really great. And thanks to my audio producer extraordinaire, Marcos Campito. I'm glad I found you. Thanks for listening, and if you like what you hear, please rate us and hit subscribe.